Hello, everyone. Today we have a special guest with us, Helen Wu. Helen has debated a lot of different kinds of debate. Most recently, at University of Chicago, she debated an American parliamentary debate where she reached the quarterfinals of the national tournament, won Columbia, NYU, and Brown, and has also been debating a lot of British parliamentary recently, where she was a semifinalist at the World University Debating Championship not once, but twice in a row. Helen, it's good to have you on
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. It'll be a good time.
for sure. So, the first question I have for you is can you just tell us a little bit about your experience with debate?
Yeah, I had a pretty funny debate journey. I joined my high school debate team. I attempted to join freshman year, and they said no freshmen are allowed. So that was a bit of a fail. And then I joined when I was a sophomore. I did PF for about like 1.5 years, but it was very local. We competed in our local school league. I never did like national circuit debate or anything like that. But it was really fun and it was a really good experience. And so in college, I joined CDS, which is the Chicago Debate Society, and I started out doing American parliamentary debate, which is a 2v2 format. And I did that for about 1 to 2 years before I really decided to dip my toes into BP or British Parley, which is a bit more of a complicated format, I would say. And so I started doing that my junior year of college more seriously. And now I would say I'm a bit of a mix of American and British debate. I just do a little bit of everything.
Nice. And can you explain for us a little bit what is British parliamentary debate? I think APDA is like a bit more familiar for
Mhm.
most PFers because it's somewhat similar, but BP is a little bit out there.
Yeah, definitely. I think BP is like a very surprising format for a lot of high school debaters, especially in the US, because you rarely see a 2v2v2v2 format. Um, so BP basically is a format where there's four teams of two. There's a government side and an opposition side, which is pretty similar to, I guess, AF and NEG in PF. But I think the crucial difference is number one, you debate motions, which are topics that you are not really given in advance. You have 15 minutes to prepare. And the second big difference is that you're trying to beat every one of the teams in the round. So if you're on opening, you're going to run why you think the motion is true or why you think the motion is false. But if you're on closing, you have to try to do that better than your opening teams. So you have to either prove something strategic that they missed or maybe give an argument that you think is more important than their argument and weigh those things against each other. And so I think when you think of it as like a sort of optimization game, in other formats, you're optimizing against one team, and in BP, you really have to try to think about optimizing against three other teams in the debate.
Yeah, I feel like it produces such interesting dynamics that we never get
Mhm.
exposed to in these like 2v2 debate formats. And so I think that's really interesting to explore. So I have some questions about your experience with BP and debate in general. First of all, how would you say BP is different than PF? You've already talked about how it's sort of structurally different, but my question is more like how does that structural difference produce differences in the way you think about arguments and motions?
Yeah, I think it's super different. One of the major differences is just that like there are teams to call you out on your BS, which like doesn't usually exist in a 2v2 format because you can say something and it's accepted as true and there's no one speaking after you. And so it's like the last word usually wins. And that's something I really had to get used to, which is like if you don't prove an argument very well, or if there was a different way to prove it, someone will say that. And so you do have to be pretty acutely aware of not just like running the first thing that comes into your mind, but trying to find the truth value of what the best argument or the most comprehensive argument is. So I think that's very different. And I think the other thing, which is pretty interesting, is I just think the way that people who do BP think about argumentations is like very different than PF. And so like PF, you're traditionally taught the like link, sorry, the like argument, link, impact structure. It's like very linear. And when I like explain to people the difference, I think it's like a geometric difference. Like in PF, you think very like horizontally linearly, whereas in BP, you tend to think about arguments as like packages, right? It's like you have in an argument you want to prove. There are many, many burdens you have to prove about that argument. Like, what do people want? Why is this inherently good? Why is this like better than all the other alternatives that tend to exist? And so it's less about running as many things as possible. It's less about speed, and it's more about just proving one thing very concretely and filling in all of the burdens of that argument. So that's sort of, I think, like the major difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. Before I move on, I do want to investigate this a little bit. I think this is a nice conversation to have
Mhm.
because burdens is such an interesting
Yeah.
idea in debate as like a part of an argument, a part of this package that you're talking about. So first, the basic question, like, what would you say is a definition of like the burden
Mm.
of an argument?
I think a burden is like something that has to be true in order for your argument to exist. Like I think a good example of this is like um in PF, you might be like, it's raining, so I need to bring an umbrella. But like in BP, I think you would have to prove like if you're raining, why are you likely to get wet? Why is that wetness bad? And why is the like umbrella the best option for you instead of like a raincoat or something like that? And so it's just like I think a lot of the times in life we assume that like A leads to B, but there's often like many steps in between, and those steps are what I think people tend to call burdens.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So in PF, I guess the closest equivalent would be like we would say there's a missing warrant or something. Like
Yeah.
you haven't thoroughly explained the argument enough. And maybe the idea here is that in BP, there's like a higher standard for warranting these arguments. And one thing that came to my mind when we're discussing burdens is it seems like some of them are kind of like preempting intuitive responses to the argument. And I
Mhm.
wonder, like, to what extent is something necessary for an argument before they make a response versus like preempting a response that they might make? Because obviously, right, like the umbrella example, I think is a great one to use here.
Mm.
Um, like if they might make some ludicrous responses that you really can't come up with. For example, like I'm struggling to think of any right now, but maybe there's like acid rain and like an umbrella isn't good enough to stop
Yeah.
acid rain. It will like actually burn through the umbrella. Or like maybe an umbrella is incredibly expensive. And to what extent like do you need to, or to what extent are those burdens of your argument versus just like a response that you can defend against after the fact?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. I would say that, like, in general, when you think about burdens, the burdens that are often the hardest and the most important to prove are the ones that would, like, logically be the instances or the premises that you get pressed on the most. So, like, if no one's going to press you on whether or not acid rain happens, then, like, that's probably not a huge structural burden for you to prove. But if someone does press you on, for instance, how, like, I don't know, eating chicken brings about nuclear war or something like that seems like it would be a higher burden argument because there's just more things you need to prove along the way. Um, and so I think like even when you think about trying to convince someone in real life, you tend to not think about convincing the dumbest person possible, right? And so it's like in PF, maybe if it's like relatively more tech over truth, if your opponent is really bad, you can like get away with just saying something and it might be accepted as true. Whereas in BP, even if you have like really bad opponent, if you didn't prove what the judge perceives to be the burden of the argument, you would still lose, even if no one calls you out on that. Which is why I think like sort of being preemptive about what someone might say is both like a good thing to be aware of in debate. It just makes your argument stronger, but also I think it's like how people tend to operate in real life, where like it's not just that everything you say tends to be taken at face value.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think intuitively the result of this is that BP debaters tend to be like much better at actually constructing like very well warranted and very
Mm,
well thought out.
sometimes.
I mean, okay, it's all relative, right? Like just
Yeah,
I
definitely.
think the average PFer certainly like blow them out of the water. Not every BPer is going to be great at mechanizing all of their arguments anyway, or fulfilling all of their burdens. But I think like because of the way that you think about arguments differently, it leads you to make arguments differently as well. And that's like a really interesting thing to tease out. Okay, we've talked a lot about BP. I want to talk also about like your takes on debate more broadly, since you've done so many
Mhm.
different styles. And the one place we can start here is what advice would you have for people who are starting out debate? Most of the people I think viewing my channel are people starting PF or who have already done PF for some time. So, what is your best advice for them?
Yeah, shout out to the prospective PFers. I think like my biggest advice is don't be discouraged by the progress you have in the beginning and don't be discouraged by like a lack of institutional support as well. In my own debate experience, it's been such a like funny, volatile journey. I started out, I got like sent to this like random debate camp. I had no idea what PF was. I probably lost every single round that I did. My partner was like crying in the bathroom. It was like a whole mess. And even in college, like my very first college debate tournament in person, I went 0 for 5, which like statistically, I don't even think should happen. And so it was like quite discouraging at the start. And I think part of that is because when you don't come from a school with a lot of like debate resources or debate backgrounds, it's just hard to figure out like what's even happening in the format in the first place. And I think realizing that everyone's progress is very different. You can definitely celebrate the small wins. I surely did at the start of my debate career. And also that like I just think there are plenty of ways to be able to learn and improve this YouTube channel. For one, like that don't require like going to a really fancy school that sends you to all the best tournaments. And a lot of it is just personal diligence, just understanding what an argument is, being, I don't know, having a good schedule and just like caring a lot about the activity. That's my biggest advice. It's just like, yeah, I don't think there's many constraints that um have to necessarily hold you back if you're really passionate about the activity.
I guess this is a good transition too, because I want to ask you, like, okay, you're mentioning you only did local circuit PF, which it's different. Some people say, I guess it's like maybe slightly less competitive, some people would say.
Oh yeah.
Um, yeah, no shade to like local circuit. I did my fair share
Okay, love
as
it.
well. And you're saying like you went 0-5 at your first college tournament, and to some extent this might have been a fluke. But my question to you is like, how did you get so much better? Like going 0-5 year one to back-to-back world semifinals. What do you think is a cause of all of that progress?
Yeah, a little bit of luck. But I think more than that, what I realized was sometimes it's actually really helpful to start any format of debate as like a relatively blank slate. Like I think when you tend to transition from one format that you're very into for a really long time, you have to unlearn old habits. And I think that can be really hard sometimes. So I think like really like going in, not knowing much of anything was very helpful. And I think like because of that, adopting a mentality of like learning what the fundamentals and like how a format looks at its core is a lot more helpful than like diving in and trying to just like give really fast speeches or really good speeches. And I think a good example of that is like in BP, I struggled for a really long time about figuring out what does it even look like to make a good argument, right? Like what does it look like to meet your burden of proof and to have an insulated case that's very preemptive. And so I would like watch videos, and I think the normal reaction to people watching videos is like, let me write down every single thing this person says and like what arguments they're giving. But like that's not super helpful when you're a beginner because like I don't really need to know like how, I don't know, like green energy is created through like solar panels or something like that. I think what's a lot more important is being like, how do these really good people that I admire construct arguments? Like how much time are they spending on each kind of argument? What is making them so successful? What does their speech sound and feel like? And I think doing that with both PF and APTA and BP and really thinking about like sort of big picture reasons why you want to improve or get better at an activity like tends to be a lot more helpful than I think diving into like the kind of things you would do once you've already got the basics down.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, the next question is a bit of a different one. What would you say are your biggest like debate hot takes?
Ooh,
Very open-ended.
yeah, this is a funny question. I think like maybe two hot takes. First hot take is like evidence is good, but evidence can only get you so far. And I think like there's a lot to be said about basic logical reasoning as a technique and a good technique in the debate toolbox. Because like at this like day and age, you can find any evidence about anything you want. And so it's like very hard sometimes to like decipher which piece of evidence is better than the other. Whereas I think if you rely on basic intuitions that people know, it's like a good way to very cleanly like break a deadlock between like, oh, source A said this, source B said this. So that's my first hot take. And my second hot take is like people should do more debate formats. Like, I don't know, I think people tend to have like a very loyal, like, this is my format. I'm gonna ride or die on this hill. I think like I've learned so much by just like trying out different things. Um, I don't know if this means like the average PF kid should go do policy or something, but I do think that like breaking out of your bubble every once in a while, whether that's like even within your format, the kind of like strategy you're used to, or just trying out different types of debate is like super helpful and like very invaluable.
Yeah, for sure. I maybe I wasn't counting. Was this hot take one or was this both?
Both hot takes.
Okay,
Is
okay.
that try new formats and use less evidence. My two
Makes
hot
sense,
takes.
makes sense. I happen to agree very strongly with both. I think very
Nice.
good advice. Last question about debate in general before we dive into a more specific topic. What, okay, I feel like anyone who has done debate as long as you have, it has to have like a deep reason for doing it. Beyond just like it feels good to win, you know? So what makes debate meaningful to you?
Man, this is the question. As like a graduating senior, I'm like, why have I done this activity for 4 years? Um, no, I think this is a really good question. At a like even a non-debate level, what I really love about this activity is just like the people who do it. Um, because like I don't know, there's something about debaters that I think they're the kind of people who are very interested in engaging with the world in like genuine ways, especially when you get to college. It's like there's no real reason for you to be doing this activity, right? So it's like there must be some like, I don't know, curiosity or creativity or intellectual reason that you just care about talking about things with other people. And I think also like I don't know, this sounds super weird to say, but I think debaters have like a lot of free will. And that was like something really important to me in college. It's like it's very easy to go down the path of like, okay, everyone's doing this, like everyone's applying to these jobs, they're joining these clubs. And I think a lot of the times like debaters will be like, I don't know, like they don't care about like fashion norms. They don't care about like, I don't know, the career paths that everyone says that you should go on. I don't know, like Mac is in Asia right now. Like it's very cool to see. And I think meeting that group of people really broadened my worldview and it made me like it definitely changed the trajectory of my life. And I think a lot of different ways. Whereas if I didn't join debate, I'd probably be friends with like much more homogenous type of people in college. So that's the like sort of like social answer. And I think like at a maybe like more mental level, it sounds generic, but like debate really teaches you how to care and think about things. Like in high school, I was the kind of person who would like not read the news. I'd be like proudly, I don't know, I know nothing about anything. I'm like so ill-informed. And I think debate really forces you to like not be that guy, right? To like listen to podcasts and keep up with the news and care about people in other places around the world. And that's just like a very important thing, I think, to be like an informed citizen. And I think being able to like construct arguments that are convincing and compelling and persuasive to like the average person and a wide variety of people is also super helpful, whether it's just like debating with my brother in the kitchen, or like writing an essay, interviewing for a job, or just even having conversations with friends. I think a lot of people in this day and age tend to like begin with an opinion and then try to like backtrack from there. And I think like it's a good skill to be able to like think about both sides of an argument and also have an actual reason for why you have the convictions that you do.
Yeah, for sure. Those are all amazing reasons to find debate meaningful. I feel like I resonate a lot with like the learning new things reason as well, like becoming more informed about the world. I think that sometimes when you get really, really deep into debate and all of the
Mm.
technicalities, there's a feeling of like you see behind the curtain of like the
Mm.
wizard, you know? And
Yeah.
that can start feeling, I've heard some people say this, and I think I've felt this too. That can start feeling like a little bit disillusioning. Like
Mm.
maybe when you first come into debate, you see all of these incredible people giving incredible speeches, and then you
Yeah.
slowly start to learn like, oh wait, it's all just, you know, uniqueness and link and impact, or it's all just
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
words,
yeah.
and they're just playing this formula that they've done over and over again. It's all cookie cutters. And I think sometimes that can make you like lose respect for what you are doing a little bit. And the more it's like the more you understand it, like you sort of conquer it by knowing it better. And for some people, there's a sense of losing wonder when that happens.
Yes, yes,
So
definitely.
I think it's healthy to take a step back once in a while and like look at it objectively and be like, holy shit, you know, I'm giving like incredible speeches here. Like I'm doing
Mm.
something I never could have done before, and I know so much more about the world than I did before. because of this. And I'm like, I'm spitting facts, you know?
Yeah, no, no, definitely. I think like this is something I really resonate with because it's like the saying where if you're able to adopt either side at the flip of a coin, do you really believe anything? And that's something I grappled with for a little bit. I'm like, do I have opinions anymore? Or do I just like get convinced by a variety of different things? And so that's a little bit of like losing the like dream of debate and also just being like, wow, I'm like little robot like printing out arguments that I think like will win me the round. I think, and this is something I really appreciated like debating you as well, where there's definitely a way to approach debate where you can both be very good, but also find like wonder and joy and give like speeches that you insert personal anecdotes in. There's like funny jokes if it's that kind of round, where you try to come up with like a metaphor, an analogy, and even like just run an argument that's like interesting and unique, even if it's not the one that you think is the best argument because it's something you believe in. And I think like those like moments of small joy are what makes debate such a great activity, right? Because like I don't know, there's one topic and infinite amount of speeches you can make for that one topic, which is like super cool.
For sure. Completely agree. And on the topic, just moving back one step, on the topic of like becoming more worldly, maybe more like understanding more facts about the world at any given moment. I know that you recently published a very nice public resource called a Matter
Okay.
File for people.
Mhm.
Can you tell me just a little bit about that? Maybe tell our audience a little bit. What is a Matter File? Why did you do this? Why is it helpful?
Yeah, so okay, what is a matter file? That's a good first question. In BP, and I guess to some extent APTA, you're not allowed to use the internet, which is good. You have to like know facts. But there's this sort of like, I guess, life hack where it's like you are allowed to bring printed material to tournaments that are called matter files, and they're just literally files of whatever matter you want that you can prepare ahead of time. And so like I think you can think of it as the equivalent of like a personal encyclopedia. Because like to be fair, printed material does include encyclopedias, so you could like technically bring that to a tournament. But I think matter files tend to feel a bit more personal and customized to what you think like you might need to know or what might be important for a given tournament. Why did I make a matter file and why do I think it's useful? Well, the easy answer is because I'm pretty ignorant about a lot of things and I have a really bad memory. And so like I'm the kind of person where I'll watch a movie and like 2 weeks later I forget the entire plot. Like I literally cannot recount the plot at all, which is nice because I can like rewatch things and I'm like, oh my God, I forgot that happened. But having a matter file is very good for me because it's like I like to be informed about the world. I like to have like a basic set of facts and knowledge, but obviously like you're not going to remember every small detail. So I think matter files just like at a utility level, just let you reference, like, for instance, there's a roundabout Sudan or there's a roundabout Vietnam or Panama. And you can go to that section of the matter file and just like understand what the most relevant news stories are and jog your memory. So that's like the utility aspect of it. But I think like more important than that, it's a very good like disciplining tool where a lot of the times we either forget to engage with like news and facts about the world, or we just passively listen and we like don't really remember what we listened to. And I think matter filing is super helpful because sort of the outgrowth of what my matter file even was in the first place was just like I would listen to podcasts like the New York Times podcast, like Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and then I would like go in my notes app and write like little summaries of like, okay, so like this world leader did this on this day. And eventually I'm like, okay, if I have like a 10-page notes app, I might as well just put this into a Google Doc and sort it by country and sort it by issue. Um, and so just like that becoming a habit that you build over time makes you realize like, oh, like news is a growing body of information. And once you start listening, you like understand what a news story is about because you like have been following the same story for a few years. And so it's something that I would like want to even keep practicing, maybe in a less intensive way after debate, because I just think it's a really good tool for people to have. And so that's why like there's plenty of goated people who release their better matter files than mine, but I think much more important than having a matter file is like having your own matter file and thinking about like what you want to know, what is important to you, because it's like truly like I learned so much by making it.
That's gotta be like one of the coolest parts of BP to me is like I meet BP people like you and they just know so much about everything. Like anything you could possibly find in emotion and debate, like they have some facts ready to go. And I guess just to illustrate this a bit, do you have any like a favorite example of a round where something you researched for your matter file came in handy?
Yeah, yeah, this is a good question. There's two rounds I can think of. One round was in Vietnam. One of the in rounds, it was like this house believes that Vietnam should adopt the five cities model, which is basically like instead of developing the capital city, you develop like all five of the cities. And so the top half of the debate runs like a pretty good case. They're like, these are all the reasons why developing multiple cities is good. Like kind of generic, but like pretty intuitive. And we're like, oh God, what do we run? And we open our matter file and it's just like this city does this city does that. And I'm like, okay, our extension is just gonna be if the fish city catches fish and the other city can't catch fish, then we get more fish. And just like literally giving like examples of which each city does and why it's like unique and no other city can fill in that burden. And I'm like, I really don't think we're winning by skill. We're literally just winning by like the facts that we have on the paper. And a pretty other similar example is like there was this other debate where it was like the US this house regrets the US's involvement in Panama in the Panama world. And like similarly, we just had like a matter file that was just history of Panama 101. And you can imagine just being like reading off of the document of like, this is what happened in Panama, guys. And we were opening in that case. And I think like it was hard to say anything else in that round once you basically say everything there is to be said historically. And so I think it's like a bit of a like fun story to just be like, yes, like I have exactly what I need. And there's also been times where I'm like, I have literally nothing to work off of, and that's the nightmare scenario. So I think, yeah, it's a good like tool to fall back on.
Yeah, nice, nice. Okay, well, without further ado, I guess we can further illustrate this a little bit because I would love to talk with you about the upcoming April PF topic. Now, a disclaimer, technically, we don't know what the topic is going to be yet,
Oh,
actually. So I'm being a little bit brash because I think I know what the topic will be. But yeah, we have to wait for March 1st for the vote to be announced. The
this is
poll,
our legal disclaimer.
yeah, that's the disclaimer. The polls are looking good for this topic.
Mm,
My prediction is that the April topic, which includes the Tournament of Champions, will be all about nuclear energy. So the exact wording of the topic, I think it's resolved the United States federal government should substantially increase investment into domestic nuclear energy. So I have several questions for you about how you would like approach this topic, your perspective on it, and maybe we can figure out what this reveals about like the thought process that comes from
mm,
years of BP training as well. So I don't know how I want you to do this. Like maybe you can pretend this is a BP motion, or you can pretend it's like
yeah.
PF topic, whatever you want to do. We can also like bounce between those perspectives. But my first question, regardless, is what is like the first thing that you think of when you would be prepping a topic like this? What are your first instincts?
Yeah, this is maybe another debate hot take. My instinct when I'm prepping or writing a case for one side is to think of the other side first. Like I will literally think about the arguments the other side is likely to run because I think that's the best way to insulate your arguments. Because you're not arguing against a wall, you're arguing against another human being. So let's say I was like on AF in this topic, I would think about all of the reasons what Neg would say about why nuclear energy isn't good or why the current level investment is sufficient and be like, okay, so I know that in my case on AF, I need to prove that there's a need for nuclear energy, that this nuclear energy is better than all the other forms of energy that exist, and that the current level of investment is not enough, because that's naturally what the neg is going to say. So that's like my first instinct. And I think I would do the same thing on neg. And I think this is a very good way to also figure out what is this debate about? Like, what are we arguing here? What is the point of setting this topic and why are people voting for it? So that's like my very first step.
That makes complete sense. Honestly, already, like you're changing my perspective because
Mm,
I just actually just released a video on my channel right before, like literally like an
mm.
hour ago. There was
Dang.
my topic analysis. I didn't even think about like current investment. Like that's obviously.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, like I think that a lot of PFers, myself included, clearly, sort of just take for granted that like the topic would be set because this thing doesn't already exist enough.
Mhm.
Um, but obviously, a like a brilliant neg line might be just like, yes, investment into nuclear energy is good, but we actually are in like a Goldilocks position right
Yeah,
now.
exactly.
like a perfect amount of investment. Maybe like there's you could go further, like extra investment into the industry actually like just destabilizes the industry in some
Yeah,
way. I don't know.
definitely.
And then suddenly you get like these crazy new avenues for offense that I think I would never have considered. So already, this is awesome.
Mhm.
I do want to ask about one thing. You're using a few words that I think are unfamiliar to PFers.
Mm,
Um, and I think this is a really interesting conversation. So what do you mean by like insulating an argument?
mm. Yeah, dang, I didn't think I would be the person to fall victim to the debate jargon. First. But yeah, insulating an argument is just like so the normal way that a debate plays out is I say A, you say B, I respond to B, you respond to my response to B. So that's kind of inefficient because if I know that you're going to say B, why would I just not respond to that ahead of time? And then you're forced to say like B plus three, right? And so like I think insulating an argument is exactly that. It's if you know the natural inclination of where this argument is going to be challenged, you preemptively build that into your argument. So when the other team says it, they sound very silly, or they can't say it and they sort of struggle to think about what's going to happen. And I think this is like kind of interesting too, because in PF, you already do this by blocking out your responses in the rebuttal. But it's interesting to me that teams block out their responses, but they don't necessarily think about just incorporating those preemptions into the case itself, right? Like it's kind of an interesting thing because you've already thought through the whole debate, but you don't think
Right.
about accelerating it.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is actually, I mean, this is interesting because this is advice that I have recently started giving some PFers. Is like, dude, you've heard this response like
Right?
5 rounds in a row. Like, why are you not slightly changing your case? Like, just
Right, exactly.
like you read the same card in response every single time. Just put that in the original argument, and then like it's easy. So yeah, I think this is a concept we need to start adopting.
Mhm.
Insulating the argument. Okay. I think it's always interesting to um like identify some of the differences in jargon between the different events because that can display a lot of these interesting like I don't know, different ways of thinking about arguments.
Oh,
Uh
100%. I think like the words that each format uses even are very indicative of how they think about that activity and like what the ethos of that activity is. Like talking about a mechanism versus a link is different because a link implies like a linear structure, whereas a mechanism implies like a more robust structure. Like I just think those small differences are super fascinating.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's so interesting. Like language really influences how you
Yeah.
even can think about the arguments. Okay, cool. So love the first instincts. We need to talk about why the topic has been set in the first place, what is happening with regard to nuclear energy right now. A lot of things that we would probably call like uniqueness, like what does the status quo look like?
Mhm.
Then what do you think are the most important like questions that might appear in the debate, that debaters need to answer to win in this nuclear energy topic?
Yeah. I think maybe this is another hot take, but I believe that we tend to try to build arguments in like a we come up with the argument first and then we build that argument. I think the most important thing to do is actually figure out what arguments are most important and start from there. And so the questions that I would ask for this topic is like, what does the US federal government care about and how much money do they have? Um, what does investment look like right now? And why is there a need to either increase, stabilize, or decrease that amount of investment? What other options are there for domestic nuclear energy, or sorry, domestic energy production? And then why does nuclear energy have like either a unique harm or a unique benefit compared to those forms of energy? So, like, we're not saying that domestic nuclear energy is good. We're saying that it's better than green energy. We're saying it's better than solar panels. We're saying it's better than coal and oil and all of these other things. So like those are the kinds of questions that I would be asking. And I think an answer to that question then becomes the outgrowth of an argument. Because if the answer is nuclear energy is safer or that nuclear energy is more efficient, fuel efficient or monetarily efficient, then that becomes the thing that you're trying to prove rather than being like, I want to prove that it's better and then like invent reasons for why that's the case.
100%. Honestly, like you took the words right out of my mouth. I think I said something almost word for word the same as one of the things that you said, which is like these arguments need to be about why nuclear energy is better or worse than
Mhm.
other energy, not just why it's good. Um, totally agree. You were also saying, so I want to talk about the first thing that you said, which is what does the United States federal government care about? This is a really interesting difference, I think, in intuitions between PF and like parliamentary styles like APDA or BP, is that in parliamentary styles, I think we always kind of identify like the actor in the motion, right?
Yeah.
In this case, the entity that is doing the policy is the United States federal government. And so we
Hmm.
sort of adopt the perspective of the United States federal government. Whereas in PF, I think the natural inclination is like, who cares what the actor is? They're just the one
Mm.
doing it. Like we always sort of try to adopt a normative, like it doesn't matter. We're not any particular person in the world. We just care about the world being a better place in general. So I guess my question is, why do you think there is this instinct in parliamentary styles toward looking at it from the perspective of the actor? Or why do you think there's this difference between the perspectives of the different debate formats? It's the same topic.
Yeah. I think one big reason is because in PF, people tend to think about impacts as like a binary. So it's like this impact happens or doesn't happen. And obviously they talk like we talk about things like magnitude and whatnot. But I think what the actor has the capacity and incentives to do influences the extent that you can prove that impact happens a lot or happens a little. And I think maybe a secondary thing is like I think the ways we think about like how much fiat the like topic itself has is pretty different. Where like you assume that if the US federal government substantially increases investment, they do it in one specific way. But what the government cares about definitely influences um, how are they increasing investment, right? Is it like funding a few large firms? Is it just having subsidies? Is it investing in smaller firms or building new nuclear power plants or making old ones more efficient? And also, like, if this is something that the government isn't super happy about, then it might be true that you increase investment right now, but that might mean you have to significantly decrease investment in other kinds of green energy because you use so much of your political capital. And so I think when in parliamentary debate, it's less like, I am this actor, what is good for this actor, but more like what this actor thinks is good or bad influences your ability to even access those normative arguments at all. And so maybe that's why, where you assume that actors and states of the world are not fixed states, they're like changing states.
That makes so much sense. That's a great clarification. I think I did sort of misunderstand you earlier. I had the misperception that you meant like think about what the US federal government cares about, as in if there's an impact that they don't care about, it doesn't matter as much.
Mm.
That's not really the argument. I think that this makes a lot of sense. And this is also something that I think PFers don't think about quite enough is
Hmm.
I think this is spot on. Like if the United States federal government uh, has completely different interests, those interests might influence how this investment is done
Yeah.
or the other steps along the way. Like there are so many intermediate steps between the topic happening and getting to your impact, each of which are sort of also modulated by the United States federal government's reaction to each of these things. And so I think 100% we need to start by talking about like what are the incentives and the capacities that the government has in general and in the specific context of this topic. Uh,
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just to quickly add on that, I think in every debate, there's actually like two debates, right? There's the debate of like, is this thing good or bad? Like, is nuclear energy good or bad? But there's this also this debate where it's like, the way this thing gets executed could be relatively better and relatively worse. And teams are fighting to move that little like pendulum more to their side and less to the other side. And so to the extent that you can win the secondary debate, like I think the primary debate becomes like a lot easier for you to win too.
that is such a good point. And that's such a good way of putting it. I feel like this is actually a concept I've struggled to explain to PFers in the
Mm.
past. Because it is definitely more of like a parley intuition. Like I feel like
Mhm.
beginners in BP understand like, okay, I need to say this is done in a smart way or this is done in
Yeah.
a dumb way.
Yeah.
I think maybe I just like diagnosing a little bit. I think maybe the
Mhm.
reason that this is lacking so much in PF is because it's not a thing in like policy or LD because those events have different kinds of fiat, right? Like in policy,
Yeah.
you actually can choose how to do the implementation.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so it doesn't make sense to say that the implementation would be done in a good way or a bad way. Like it's done in whatever the way the app wants it to be done.
Mhm.
And since PF has almost exclusively been sort of mimicking those events, we forget that we don't have that kind of fiat. You know, like in
Mhm.
PF, we are debating about the most likely implementation from this actor. And so
Yeah.
instead, I think this is one of the perfect places for PF to take some wisdom from BP and a bit of APDA as well, or just these kinds of events that also have like the most likely implementation kind of interpretations of the debate topics. Okay, I have a couple more questions for you about this topic, and then we can finish up. So the next question I have, which arguments do you think are going to be most common on both sides, or like which arguments should be most common on both sides?
Mm.
Because I know like you're approaching this from a bit of a different standpoint than PFers. So maybe the PFers will come up with these crazy arguments, and those will be the most common. But what would you expect would be most common in like BP?
Yeah, I think on the AF side, it would be we characterize that there's an energy crisis right now, in terms of cost, in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of geopolitics, like I don't know, like how we are losing access to critical partners, and turning protectionist. Then we explain like, okay, domestic nuclear energy, there's a pretty big ability to scale up. It's relatively cheap, relatively efficient. It's relatively safe, and there's a lot of measures that are making it more and more safe as time goes on. And that is the solution to a lot of the problems that we have right now. And that is very good because even if it is sustainable to rely on other energy sources right now, we don't know if that's true in 5 to 10 years. And if we don't increase investment right now, like we're not going to be able to scale it up like very, very quickly as time goes on. So I think the biggest thing is just being like, it might not be perfect, but it's the best option we got. And other alternatives just like are not going to be panning out. So I don't know, that's a very like BPE way to look at it. And I'm sure there's tons of like evidence and experts that like say something different. But I honestly think like just proving that one very clear thing um is like my intuition of what should be the argument. And then I think on the other side, it should be uh pivoting the debate as much as possible from that version of the world where it's like we have plenty of other sources of energy, and these sources are way better sources of investment. And I'm sure you can find some like niche facts or like niche sources that are just like the capital efficiency of like this hydroponic like energy source is way better than nuclear energy. And really saying those things are good and then turning and being like, yes, nuclear energy could be okay, but like there's probably decreasing marginal returns and we have a decent amount of investment right now that we can rely on in the worst case scenario, but we like don't really need to get a lot more nuclear energy. And then the classic PF arguments of like radioactive material is harmful for health and like there's a lot of nuclear accidents and there's a potential for like I don't know, miscalculation and stuff like that. But I think like the first two layers are probably more important than just being like nuclear energy is bad on face.
That makes sense. There's another difference I think in the way that we construct arguments that I'm noticing here is like on the AF, on the gov, whatever. You're describing all of these different points as like parts of one whole argument.
Mm.
Whereas I think in PF, like at the very least, this would probably be something we separate into like three arguments. Like contention one is cost, contention two is the nuclear stability or like energy stability, contention three is geopolitics, whatever. So it's interesting that you are like identifying all of these as parts of one argument.
Mm. Yeah, that is actually kind of interesting. I think like there's definitely something to be said about both in BP and in PF, where it's very good to have arguments that are very mutually exclusive from each other. And I think this is something that like both PFers and BPers can like take note of, where it's like even if I'm talking about this as if it's one argument, they should be like very logically distinct reasons. So if you take one out, the other one still stands. And in PF, if we want to separate into three arguments, that's like fine. But making sure that they're logically distinct and don't just collapse into the same argument is like pretty important. And I think maybe in PF you just split it because it's more disciplining to do that. I don't know. It's like,
Maybe, but I think you're right. Like sometimes the splitting obscures the actual uh like dependence that they have on
yeah.
similar premises. So yeah, it's definitely something to think about. My thought is like there's if there's like a I don't know if there's a spectrum between like too much grouping and too much splitting. PF is probably slightly on the splitting side where we like over split arguments. We love having like way more numbers. Like I have five contentions. Do you? Maybe it's like two.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I think that there are some harms of this that are not always recognized. And one of the harms is if your opponents are smart, they'll just wise up and figure out that there's one premise that multiple of your arguments depend on and then answer that.
Yeah.
And it can actually be harder for you to keep track of all of the dependencies that are happening in your case.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in like PF, there's people are like, oh, you should have like a shiny object that's just like a distraction argument. And I'm like, well, if you have the time, couldn't you just make a good or like you know what I mean? Just make your argument better. Because like if you're like already admitting you're not gonna win on that argument, I don't know. I tend to be like, there's limited time in the world, and we shouldn't spend that limited time making silly arguments that are just distractions. I don't know.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And I guess it also, not to explain everything from like differences in formats, but it also makes sense coming from a VPer because like it would make zero sense to have a time suck argument in a VP round. Like, you
Right? Yeah, you'd be laughed at.
like who are you distracting? The judge?
Yeah, no, actually, you're distracting yourself.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Okay, last few questions I have for you. One, which side on this nuclear energy topic do you intuitively feel is stronger?
Mm.
If you got the draw, like which position would you celebrate getting?
Probably, I think in general in debates and including this debate, it's easy to defend the status quo just because like the non-status quo tends to be pretty speculative.
Hmm.
Um, in general. And so like you would have to come up with like new reasons that are never going to be 100% certain for why like other energy sources might be better or worse or might what might end up happening. And I really think on neg if you just take the line of like the current investment is sufficient and we don't know if additional investment will just like mess up the nuclear energy landscape at all. So like even if AF is like nuclear energy is good, like being like, yeah, then we shouldn't mess it up, right? Like slowly increase investment or something like that. Like I think that's just like a such a intuitive and like easy line to take that I don't know if it's stronger, but certainly it seems like much more instinctual.
That's so interesting because, like, really, out of all of the lines you mentioned, I think that one specifically is the one that I thought of least when I was thinking about the topic.
Really?
Yeah, like, but it makes
Really?
sense. Like, it should be intuitive, I think. It stems from the exactly the things that you said were your first instincts, for very logical reasons. I think it's incredibly strong too. Like, obviously, if you're able to prove A, that there is enough investment right now that, the AF doesn't really is not necessary, and most of the arguments from the AF become non-unique. And second, if you can prove that there's a risk that you actually disrupt the nuclear sector, maybe it's harder to access some of your core, disads or whatever. Like it's harder to say, oh, nuclear waste is bad. But it's easier, certainly, to like steal almost all of the AF arguments.
Yeah, right. And that's why I like to think about the other side first, because like I'm kind of lazy, so I'd rather like go and steal their arguments than try to just be like, competing on the exact opposite ground.
100%, 100%. And I'm thinking maybe there's still a way to like do both anyway. Like, I
I
guess,
think you could do both.
yeah, 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 right? To me, I
Where it's
think.
like I think often. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think maybe my Wi-Fi is not so great right now. What I was saying is, to me, it seems like possibly the disadvantage of this strategy would be sacrificing some of the other ground that you have as neg. Like if you argue that you're disrupting nuclear energy, it might be difficult to then say that nuclear energy is bad. Like, then would it be a good thing to disrupt it? Um, but yeah, I think there maybe are ways that you can run both arguments without tension between them. I don't know
Yeah,
though.
well, like I think like nuclear energy is good when done well is the like premise that AF goes for. And then you just like ask the question like, okay, then like what are the reasons why things tend to be done badly? And it's usually because you rush them and there's no regulation and there's no oversight. And I think like if you think about any industry that has like grown super suddenly, that's when you get like accidents and, all these dangers of like safety, public safety issues. And I think like that's the risk of substantially increasing rather than just like letting it grow naturally, right? Is that the government doesn't want to regulate it because they're investing so much, and also like they don't have the capacity and resources. Like I feel like they can very much so exist in the same argument.
100%. I think I've caught myself thinking too much in a binary again, of like either in the debate nuclear energy is good or it's bad. But
Mhm.
just like you're saying, like if we even go back to the earlier argument about like the implementation, like it can be done well or it can be done badly, then you can obviously sort of both can exist at once, both can be true
Yeah,
at the same
definitely.
time. And so yeah, I think this is like a this is exactly what I wanted to get out of this interview series. It's like, combining these different ways of thinking about arguments with like revelations about how we can build new kinds of arguments in a PF topic that can help us in deeply strategic ways and that we might be overlooking because our paradigm is too limited at the moment. So thank
Yeah,
you so
definitely.
much for revealing some interesting things to me, and for just coming on and talking about your experience with debate. It's been great to have you. Do you have any last things that you want to say?
No, this has been super fun. I think it's always fun to like yap about meta debate topics. Um, I guess I don't know. Maybe I'll ask you a question, which is what do you like wish people would get out of watching this video series, and like what is your biggest takeaway from running it?
Wow, that's a good question. The script has been flipped on me a little.
Yeah, the script is gone.
The interviewee becomes the interviewer. What do I hope people get out of this video series? I think one is what I was just talking about, which is like, I think that a lot of people who watch my videos are coming from a purely PF background, or they're coming from a background of PF where they have been learning how to get better at debate by trying to mimic policy, or maybe trying to mimic some LD as well. But I think a lot of them might be under the assumption that those formats are the only ones that are valuable to learn from, and that the paradigms of other formats, like any other debate format, especially maybe parley debate formats, are less valuable, especially for technical PF at the national circuit, things like they might be experiencing or expecting to experience at the TOC. And so, what I want to do with this
Hmm.
series is try to dispel that notion as much as possible. Like, what I've learned through experience in APDA, a tiny bit of experience in BP as well, a number of other debate formats is like debate is debate. There's no such thing as like, I think I had a similar notion when I first started college, coming straight out of like national circuit PF. I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to do parley. That's like
Yeah.
only for like lay debaters, right? You're just gonna tell a story and like craft a narrative and say some pretty rhetoric, and then it's like a speech event. But I think clearly that was so incorrect. And it's not just that it was incorrect that speech is also valuable, don't get me wrong, but it was incorrect in that there's so many valuable things to learn technically, like in terms of
Yeah,
how
that's
we
interesting.
craft arguments and in terms of how they interact in the debate and how you can like win rounds in the highest levels of PF at the national circuit that we are just not thinking about enough because we're not tapping into the inspiration that we can draw from these other styles of debate because we view them as too foreign and maybe even like lower than our like more technical,
Mhm.
more tabula rasa
Yeah.
style. It's like a better ideal version of debate. It's nonsense. Like all of us are using some assumptions. There is no such thing as true tabula rasa. We all just exist on different ends of like different places in a grand spectrum. And all of these different debate events have something to offer us, some new lesson that we can take away and that we can add to like our mixture of all of the things we use to construct arguments and learn about debate and help us win these debate rounds. And I also think like it's not just that it's like unfortunate that people are not learning from like BP, etc. It's like deeply unstrategic. Like that there is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
a
Definitely.
hole in PF debate that is just begging to be filled because uh like there's a bunch of weaknesses in PF debate that are like weaknesses that are so prevalent at the highest levels of the event that open people up to vulnerabilities in their debating that can be very easily exploited if you do bother to learn what other people are not learning. Um, and yeah, so that's one thing that I hope people get out of this. Is like there are things that people have to tell you that are valuable, and you should listen to them. Um, People from all sorts of diverse perspectives. The second thing is, I think this is just fun. Like,
Yeah, it is really fun.
I get to reconnect with a bunch of people I haven't talked to in like oftentimes a few years who I've like crossed paths with at various points in my debate career. I get to have conversations about like the meta debate you were talking about, which is like something I think it's just really cool to think about. And I hope really that I can also pass that kind of along to my audience. Like I want people to have fun with debate. I want people to become passionate about like thinking and having conversations about how debate works and how it operates. Because I really think that's probably the biggest reason that I even am in this activity. Like, who cares about education? Who cares about like all that stuff? I'm here
Uh-oh.
because like, well, you know what I mean. I'm here because it's fun, first and foremost. The all the other like positive externalities are great, but they're kind of incidental to my participation. And I really hope that I can, uh, maybe partly through this interview series, like show other people what I mean when I say like, this is so cool, this is so fun. I think if I can do that, I will feel like this is a success. So thank you for helping me hopefully do that. Um, if any of the audience members have gotten as much as I have out of this interview, then I would say it's a success.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been so fun. And I agree. Debate is a fun maxing activity. And I'm just glad to maybe contribute to some of that.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for your contributions, and I hope you have a good day. And I
Yes.
will see you later.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.